universities and two colleges from remote parts of Bengal, one from Bankura and the other from the coal belt area of West Bengal, under two different universities have come together today to welcome the propounder and the sort of the flag bearer of post-colonial theory today. It is a great day for us. This webinar series of post-colonial theory and practice will open many foggy windows in our minds, and the variedness of the titles of the 3 days that will proceed will give us a better idea. And who can open this better than our keynote speaker today, Professor Bill Ashcroft? Sir, you have really, distended our hearts with pride by being here today. It is a great honor and a great privilege for us. We will now start our inaugural program. I invite our respected principal of Triveni Devi Bhalotia College, Dr. Ashish Kumar De, to deliver his welcome address on this August occasion. Principal, sir.
Very good morning to one and all.
Thank you,
At the
sir.
very outset, I welcome all of you. Actually, I feel honored that Triveni Devi Bhalotia College English Department, in collaboration of Onda College, Onda Mahavidyalaya English Department, has organized international web lecture series on contemporary trends in post-colonialism, theory and practice. The topic has taken a significant turn towards the universal, towards the human. So far my knowledge or so far my information is concerned, I know that this web lecture will be delivered by some of the best thinkers and theorists from all over the world. At this moment, I have a great proud privilege to welcome Professor Bill Ashcroft, Professor of Emeritus School of English, Media and Performing Arts, New South Wales University, Australia, and founding exponent of post-colonial theory. Actually, his present for, I am very much glad and proud for his present and for giving his consent as a, not only as a research person, but actually he will deliver his lecture on post-colonial theory today. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Fayana Makki, Professor of Post-Colonial Literature, University of Lille, France, for spending her valuable time at this web series. Professor Fayana Makki will share us her article on reading Amitabh Ghosh on a tour of Canada's petroscapes. In the next 2 days, we have also Dr. Claire Omhover, Professor of English and Post-Colonial Literature, University of Paul Valery, France, and Professor Vivas Chaudhary, Professor of English, Guwahati University, Assam. A warm welcome both of you for the touring presence of this web series. We have also, actually the day after tomorrow, we have also Professor Thomas J. Lin, Associate Professor of English, Penn State, Bath, USA, and Dr. Kunal Basu, Professor of Safe Business School, Oxford University, UK, who are a notable author. I take the opportunity to welcome both of you, sir. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Vijay Kumar Dubey, Principal, Onda Thana Mahavidyalaya, and all participants like teachers, scholars, students, and other respected dignitaries, those who have in online Google Meet or YouTube or any other Facebook or any other platform. I also mention here, and I also welcome Dr. Sarvani Banerjee, mentor of this program, and other joint organizing secretaries of both the colleges, coordinators of IPSC of both the colleges, the organizing members and committees of this web series. Actually, we live in a world of expanding units and in an age where there is no certainty of categorization. Post-colonialism addresses the issue of the historical, political, cultural, and textual ramification of the colonial encounter between the imperial West and the colonized East, dating back from the 16th century to the present time. It is a critical theoretical approach in literary and cultural studies which address issues which how the East and West how the East and West encounter shaped all those who are a party to it. It generally represents an ideological response to colonial thought rather than simply describing a system that comes after colonialism. It establishes intellectual safes for subaltern people to speak for themselves in their own voices and thus produce their own individual and cultural identity, thereby provincializing the West. But in the recent time, there has been a radical change in the field of contemporary post-colonial studies within and with this split. I hope this 3 days web lecture series will help all the attendees by enlightening them with the contemporary trends of the post-colonial studies. I think that the lectures delivered by the renowned stalwart of these post-colonial studies will illuminate them and will have a bag full of knowledge as takeaway from this venture. I end here by hoping that this web series will end up as a grand success. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Mute.
Unmute, ma'am. Unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Principal Sir, for your inspiring words. I will now request Dr. Shaurabh Kumar Nag from Odathana Mahavidyalaya to speak for himself as well as for his principal who was unable to join. Shaurabh, please.
Thank you, Sarvanidhi. A very good morning to everyone present here. I regret to announce that our principal sir is actually preoccupied with some official assignment, and that's why he could not make it. So, but he has promised to be there from tomorrow, and if possible, from the second session today. On behalf of the principal sir, Dr. Vijay Kant Dubey, Odathana Mahavidyalaya, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to all the participants. But before everything, above everything, I must thank Professor Bill Escroft. He met in Germany. I was in Bremen. I hope, sir, remember in the last year, sir had delivered a lecture at the University of Bremen. It was a webinar, it was a seminar on post-colonial oceans, and there we met. I today it is I'm so thrilled. It is like a dream come true that the books that we have grown up reading on post-colonial theories. The very man is sitting in front of me, and he will be delivering lecture for two colleges and for hundreds of participants, thousands of audiences, because we are going to stream the web lecture series every day from 7 p.m. onwards. Uh, I'm simply awestruck to have been a stock among us. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Of all the theoretical doctrines, actually, post-colonialism, according to me, is perhaps the most human because uh, post-colonialism always claims for the equal right of all the human beings, irrespective of their territorial and geographical location, cultural nuances. So it is perhaps the most human of all the theoretical aspects. I can quote Robert Young, who says that post-colonialism claims the right of all people on this earth to the same material and cultural well-being. what can be better than that kind of an attitude? And very recently, there are certain new emergences of tendencies. New tendencies are getting emerging nowadays, uh, and that are offering us a kind of universal outlook, be it deepest Chakraborty in provincializing Europe, or NGD Watchongo in global ethics. The contemporary critics are trying to offer us a kind of universal outlook, universal culture, universal worldview, where any point on earth can be the center, or in another word, we can obliterate the center. So, at the very end, I would like to thank all the faculty members of the English department of Olafana Mahavidyalaya as well as of TDB College, and a special thanks to Shorbanidhi. She has helped me immensely, and we collaborated together. We have called each other 10 times, 15 times every day to make it happen. I also extend my special thanks to the principal sir of TDB College and Sujit, my brother. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the audience. Thank you. I would like to request Dr. Sharbani Banerjee to introduce Professor Bill Ashcroft to the audience.
Now, sorry, Shora, we
Yeah.
still have the convener's
Oh,
address by
I forgot. I forgot Sujit.
Sujit
Sorry.
Malik. Yes.
Yes, yes, please.
I will. This is thank you, Shora, for your wonderful words, and especially that mention about me. Yes, we have been having nerve-wracking meetings every day, and I also include my department. We have been meeting almost every 2-3 days and finalizing this program. It is now my great pleasure to request Shujit Malik, Associate Professor of my college and my colleague. He is the head of the Department of Undergraduate Studies of our college and is the co-convener of this webinar series. I request him to share a few words. Shujit,
Okay.
please.
Good morning to all participants and Professor Bill Ashcroft. I'm with nervous, that I'm sitting, doing virtually, but I'm sitting in front of Bill Ashcroft. That's a matter of, I'm being a bit nervous. So, pandemic situation that we have been facing since last of March has restricted many activities in various fields. But we can't stop our academic pursuit. We can't stop our intellectual practice. At that outside, Department of Literature in English, TDB College, jointly with Onda Thana Mahavidyalaya, has organized an international web lecture series for 3 days, beginning from today. Noted theorists, scholars across the world will be signing as a star of this event. But I'm not going to discuss on that issue because the scholars are there. But I just want to mention one incident. That incident, Sasi Tharoor, we are all familiar with Sasi Tharoor, writer, administrator, and one of the finest orators of our time. He delivered a lecture or participated in a debate convened by Oxford University Union, and there he launched a scathing attack on colonial practice. Actually, the topic of the debate was British Raj, reparation and reclaim. That was the topic. There, Mr. Tharoor launched a scathing attack on the colonial practices, and he received huge applause from all quarters because he has done the daunting task of exposing the blackest facet of exploitation actually exerted by a colonial ruler. It was quite soothing to hear him that a colonized man, colonized, criticize colonizer directly. But it is quite, difficult for us. We will not be able to face off a colonizer directly. The post-colonial studies that it has given an ample opportunity for people like us to question the right, the question the cultural hegemony practiced by the colonial ruler. And it has, For me, post-colonial studies is just like a multifaceted instrument. It explores the violence, which established itself as an independent discipline. And thirdly, which is important right now, that is, it also locates the point of neo-colonial forces that has been surfaced in contemporary times. That was, it is just a very sketchy outline of this. I always prefer one term of this event, of this topic, that is resistance. We, the wretched of the art, post-colonialism or post-colonial studies, serve as it is an instrument of resistance for us. That is all about. I always inspire my student or ask my student, always try to add at that point of resistance. Very important. And last but not least, taking a metaphor from the cricket, I must say, the opening of the game of cricket is very important, very crucial. And the opener, he always plays a pivotal role in the game of cricket. And we have a robust opener of this event. Welcome, Professor Bill Scott, along with others. Thank you very much.
Now I would request Dr. Sharbani Banerjee to introduce Professor Bill Ashcroft to the audience.
Thank you so much, Shobra. I am sure
Welcome.
this is just a very mere formality because Professor Bill Ashcroft needs no introduction. His phenomenal books, his articles, his theories have always inspired us, has regenerated us to think anew. Nevertheless, for the young students who are here, I can see many students here. Let me, enjoy this moment of pride and privilege to introduce him to you all. He is presently Emeritus Professor in the School of English, Media and Performing Arts in the University of New South Wales, Australia. He is a founding exponent of post-colonial theory. No, who is there who has not heard of his empirical book, The Empire Writes Back? It has, until then, even presently, he is expressing new theories. I had the privilege of listening to him a month ago, and he is now presently, deliberating on a new aspect of nationalism that he likes to call transnationalism. Hope that we can hear a few words on that too, sir. He has co-authored more than 20 to 25 books, more than hundreds of articles. His most famous books after the Empire Writes Back are Post-Colonial Transformation in 2001, Post-Colonial Futures 2001, Intimate Horizons 2009, Utopianism in Post-Colonial Literature. I can go on for 2 hours if I have to read out all that he has written and spoken and thought about. But it is a day when we are very, very happy to have him here. And I would just like to share with the audience my correspondence with him some 2 weeks ago. As you all know, he is a very busy person, very academically active. And when I requested him from a small college in one corner of India, he said, Sharbani, I'm very busy. I'm overburdened and flooded with invitations, but I will do it for you if you can promise that it will complete in 1 hour and if the questions are less compared to the usual speakers. So we are very thankful, Professor Ashcroft, sir, for finding time for us. I know you are very busy and very, overexposed as of now. You are giving so many lectures for all of us. But let it be said that each lecture that you give is a new opening and a new direction for old academics like me and for new academics like those who are present here. Thank you so much, sir. I request you to now deliver your keynote address.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Banerjee. It's a very great delight to me to be here to speak to people in Indian Academy, because India has such a formative and powerful role in the development of post-colonial studies. And so I never tire of bringing that to the fore. today I'm going to talk about post-colonialism today, and I'll just bring up the try to okay, just bring up a window to share, and let's see how we go.
Yes, sir, we can see it.
Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
All right.
Yes,
Good.
sir.
So post-colonialism today is the topic of my talk, and I use that title because post-colonialism is an incredibly vibrant and changing field, and it's a field that embraces all kinds of approaches, and it embraces all kinds of theorists. You know, even people who start off critiquing the idea of the post-colonial end up being part of the post-colonial stable, if you like. So I want to think about the post-colonialism today, but first, as I often do, I want to go to the basics and say, well, what is post-colonial theory? Because there are so many misconceptions about particularly the term post-colonial. Well, it's that branch of contemporary theory that investigates and develops propositions about the cultural and political impact of European conquest upon colonized societies and the nature of those societies' responses. So there's two aspects to it. There's the impact of European conquest, and that's where Edward Said's Orientalism comes in. The nature of those societies' responses, their capacity to transform the dominant discourses that have colonized them, that is where the Empire Writes Back comes in. Now, the term, the idea of the post has been confusing people for decades, but the term refers to post-invasion, if anything, and not post-independence. It identifies neither a chronology nor a specific ontology. There's no one way of being post-colonial. It's not after colonialism, nor is it a way of being. And I want to emphasize this. Post-colonial is a way of reading. Now, it's a reading practice that draws attention to the profound and continuing effects of colonization upon literary production, upon anthropological accounts, historical records, and scientific and administrative writing. And above all, of course, it is a reading of post-colonial literatures, because it's the transformation of English in the literatures written by the colonized and formerly colonized that has transformed the field, that has in fact developed the field. And so it's important to emphasize the centrality of literature and literary study. Now, post-colonialism today is like a convivial critical democracy. Now, convivial from convivere, meaning live together. A lot of different theories and theorists and approaches and attitudes live together in this critical democracy that's called post-colonial theory. And the interesting thing about it is that, of course, it rejects normative controlling ideas about what the field is, and it welcomes all kinds of new approaches and new branches. Now, an interesting thing when we're thinking about what is post-colonialism today, an interesting thing happened in the 1990s. Globalization studies were proceeding apace, and they're mostly driven by economics and politics, and the idea of development, the development theories that many people describe the European, the Western impact on the world. But the language of literature developed a cultural turn in globalization studies. And Simon Gandhi puts it this way: post-colonialism, globalization studies have at least two important things in common. Firstly, they're concerned with explaining forms of social and cultural organization whose ambition is to transcend the boundaries of the nation state. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Secondly, they seek to provide new ways to understand cultural flows that can no longer be explained by homogeneous Eurocentric narrative of development and social change. And those two global and significant approaches are the things that bring post-colonialism and globalization together. But the important thing is the cultural turn in globalization studies is driven by the language of post-colonialism. And that language demonstrates that the strategies developed in post-colonial theory are appropriate to read the modern world. Now, around the turn of the century, there were a lot of talk, books about the future of post-colonial studies. Some people said, is the post-colonial over? What was post-colonialism? And a plethora of ideas about the future of post-colonial studies arose at the beginning of the century. Now, post-colonial studies today involves a very wide variety of studies. There's the well-known field of transnational literatures, transculturalism, multiple modernities, world literature, cosmopolitanism, post-colonial sacred, and post-colonial eco-criticism. And of course, we could add to that the emerging field of decolonial studies, but I haven't put that in because decolonialism has got nothing that post-colonial study doesn't have. So every one of these topics I could discourse for some time, but I just want to mention they're all themes that you would recognize, they're all themes that you'd be well aware of. But I am interested in the continuing relevance of post-colonial analysis. You know, a lot of people want to consign it to the 19th century of British imperialism. But what we find is that the activity of writers and colonized intellectuals has demonstrated the emergence of strategies that are important in dealing with the world today. The empires of cultural, technological, and economic power and their colonizing effects. As was mentioned earlier, neo-colonialism is alive and well. But the thing I want to point out is that post-colonial theory is not a grand theory of everything, but it does have strategies that are appropriate and useful for addressing the operation of power, social, cultural, and economic power in the world today. And when I talk about post-colonialism now, I want to mention how I am developing post-colonial studies. Three aspects to this: post-colonial utopianism, borders and bordering, and the concept of transnation. Now, utopianism in post-colonial literatures is an interesting topic to be talking about. Most people think of utopia as just pie in the sky, wishful thinking, a fantasy. But there's a very big difference between Thomas More's Utopia and the spirit of hope that drives people to imagine a different world. It's interesting that the Utopian Studies Society was formed in 1988 and Empire Writes Back was published actually in 1989. So they have a kind of coeval emergence. And yet, interestingly, utopian studies have been entirely absent from post-colonial studies for 3 decades. Now, the magisterial book by Ernst Bloch, Principle of Hope, well, actually, it's a series of 3 books, was written during the Second World War and really became, after its translation into English in 1986, it became a foundational text in utopian studies. And that has led to Frederick Jameson's Archaeologies of the Future. Both of these people are Marxists, and the interesting thing about utopian studies is it's been driven by a combination of Marxism and science fiction throughout the 20th century. But the reason I am interested in post-colonial utopianism is because the writing of post-colonial writers is always enthused, motivated. It has the dynamic of a vision of the future. Now, there's a difference between utopia and utopianism. Utopia is that placeless place. Utopianism is the spirit of hope. A difference between the representation of utopia and the anticipatory function of utopianism. Lyman Tower Sargent calls utopianism social dreaming. And Ruth Levitas says, it's the desire for a better way of living expressed in the description of a different kind of society that makes possible that alternative way of life. Now, post-colonial writing might not necessarily represent a different future, but all writing has the capacity to represent something that's driven by the imagination. And this is where the importance of utopianism to post-colonial studies emerges. Now, there's an interesting irony in Thomas More's post-utopia. There's an irony in the idea of post-colonial utopia for the simple reason that More's utopia was a classic colonizing process. King Utopus invades the land, he changes its name, civilizes the indigenous inhabitants, and cultivates the natural wasteland. And there you have a succinct model of imperial invasion and colonization. And yet that representation of the placeless place has inspired people's imaginations ever since. Now, the importance of art and literature in this is absolutely crucial. Ernst Bloch was adamant and wrote a book about the function of art and literature in imaging a different world. And interestingly, Ben Okri says, writers are the dream mechanism of the human race. Writers are the dream mechanism of the human race. That is, writers, because they operate from the imagination, have the capacity to visualize a different world. And as I said before, that world might not always be optimistic. It might not always be utopian. But the very fact that writers can dream of a different world demonstrates their dream function in human society. Now, Bloch's term for this in literature is Vorschein, foreseeing, or anticipatory illumination, the revelation of the possibilities for rearranging social and political relations to produce Heimat. Now, Heimat, of course, is a German word for home. And it was very interesting because the Nazis made a lot of use of Heimat as the racial home. And what Ernst Bloch does is turn this on its head. He says, Heimat is the home we've all sensed, but never experienced or known. It is Heimat as utopia that determines the truth content of a work of art. So this is what's driving the utopianism of literature, and particularly the utopianism of post-colonial writing. The idea of Heimat, of a home that we've sensed, of a possible world, a possible society that we sense is possible but we haven't yet experienced. And this possibility demonstrates the truth content of a work of art. Now, a critic has recently said that, you know, the most practical thing that a writer or intellectual can do is imagine utopia, because this is the thing that drives the human spirit, the idea that things can be possible, that things can change. And so Heimat becomes deeply important in Bloch's philosophy, but also deeply important in post-colonial writing. Now, very often that Heimat, that home in the future, is driven by memory, and memory not as nostalgia, but a memory of what things can be beyond the strictures of colonial and imperial control. And I want to suggest that that capacity to see beyond is what gives post-colonial theory such a purchase in addressing the contemporary world with its neo-colonial operations. Now, for Bloch, Heimat always lies beyond the border. And that introduces the idea of borders, which is another, I suppose, direction that I see post-colonial theory going in. Borders and bordering. Now, borders are something we can't imagine the world being without. But I want us to just ponder this. What would the world look like without borders? How would we live? Could we live? Are humans so ingrained in the idea of self and other, so ingrained in the idea of demonizing the other, that life would be impossible without borders? Well, the borders have grown pretty well exponentially. At the end of World War II, there were 7 border walls. And when the Berlin Wall fell, there were 15 border walls. And today, there are 77 border walls or fences. And of course, the most notorious of these is the unfinished border wall between the US and Mexico. And a lot of politicians are so committed to borders because, as Donald Trump has said, without borders, you don't have a nation. That's an interesting thought. It's probably quite untrue, but it is interesting that the way in which we conceive the nation is through borders and bordering. So what is a border? Well, naturally, we think of borders as walls, as perimeters, as things constructed to keep the outsiders out or the insiders in. But I want to suggest that a border is not a thing, but a practice. It's a practice that operates both beyond and within the physical borders of the nation state. And when we think of border and borders as bordering, as practices, it really changes the way we understand the process of bordering. It changes the way we understand the operation of colonial power, the operation of power itself. And it helps us understand the operation of that phenomenon that doesn't seem to have any borders, global capitalism. So a border is not a thing, and it's a practice moving beyond and within the physical borders of the state. So a border is both a consequence and a production of power relationships. Okay, the person who sets up the border, or the country, or the group, are the people with power. But the very establishment of the border produces those and increases and exacerbates that power relationship. And this is true of the bordering practices of contemporary nation states. So when we think about borders, we think about how human society clings to them. And yet we can see beyond them. This is the wall built in the West Bank to enclose Palestine from Israel. It's where Israel has colonized part of the West Bank and set up a wall to keep Palestinians out. And yet what we see here is a combination of the refusal of borders and the utopian vision of possibility. This little painting on the wall is a model for the way in which art and literature can look beyond the borders and bordering practices of the state to a different kind of world, a different kind of future. It's remarkably symbolic of that. Even though it seems to be achieving little, it achieves a lot through the power of the imagination. And that's why art and literature are so important. Now, when we think of borders, I'm drawn to a poem by Cavafy, Waiting for the Barbarians, which is, of course, as you know, was the poem that stimulated Jan Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians. And it goes like this: why this sudden restlessness and confusion? How serious people's faces have become. Why are the streets and squares emptying so rapidly? Everyone going home so lost in thought. Because night has fallen and the barbarians have not come. And some who have just returned from the border say, there are no barbarians any longer. Now what will become of us without barbarians? They were, those people, a kind of solution. Now, everybody listening to this today can focus on their own bordered state and see that barbarians are important. If barbarians don't exist, who are we? And if the barbarians can't be seen to be the other, who are we? What is our self? So fascinating. Without barbarians, what will become of us? In other words, borders are necessary for us to get the impression of identity. Now, identity is a fiction, and perhaps the great fiction, national identity being the great fiction of our time. But it is generated and kept in place by the bordering practices of the state. And in this case, the idea of the barbarians is a very important idea for helping us understand who we are. So the borders extend within. We often think, well, we're bound to think of a border as a perimeter, as something that's around, built around something, built around a space. But the borders operate within. And Mitchell says the boundary of the state never marks a real exterior. It is a line drawn internally within the network of institutional mechanisms through which a certain social and political order is maintained. That is the bordering practices of the state, operating within the network of institutional mechanisms. And that bordering practices, those bordering practices are the things that maintain order, maintain control, maintain power within the state. Now, Simonson says there are 8 borders or boundary markers as criteria for national membership. National ancestry, being of the national religion, birth on the country's soil, having lived in the country for most of one's life, language skills, respect for the country's laws and institutions, having host national citizenship and feeling as part of the nation. Now, you see the way those bordering practices are operating. There may be people who are not part of the national religion. There may be people who are not born on the country's soil, who haven't lived in the country for most of their life. But they're people who want to obtain citizenship. But you see the subtle way bordering practices, boundary markers work as criteria. Whatever that refugee or that asylum seeker hopes to gain, the bordering practices, the subtle bordering practices of the state are still exclude them. And so that's a very distinct way in which the bordering practices of the state work, the borders within. Now, Salman Rushdie in Step Across This Line says, good writing assumes a frontierless nation. Writers who serve frontiers have become border guards. In our deepest natures, we are frontier crossing beings. We know this for the stories we tell ourselves, for we are storytelling animals too. Now, I want to suggest that the memory of the nation state is history, national history. But the memory of the nation, those people, hello? Those people who operate between and within the borders of the state, they are the people who demonstrate the potential and the possibility of the nation. So the creative spirit, for which literature is a powerful metonym, is the ultimate border crosser. I said before that Ernst Bloch really focused on art and literature as that which has the anticipatory illumination. And also, literature is the ultimate border crosser. It is inherently post-national because its tendency is not to belong. The nationality of literatures is a function of reading rather than writing. Heimat is not the nation, but the horizon of possibility. Now, when I say national identity is a function of reading, what I mean is that a writer doesn't pick up a pen and say, I'm going to write about the nation, I'm going to demonstrate national identity here. This is a function of the institutions of reading, the criticism, publishing, the universities, teaching, all these things. And this is true particularly in Australia, because it's a young country, has a great obsession with identity. The literature is held by the institutions of reading to be signs of national identity. So this leads us, when we think about the people circulating around the bordering practices of the state. This leads us to the concept of the transnation. Now, the transnation is different from the transnational. The transnational is that operation of crossing borders, of interaction between states, between nations. The transnation is something that can cross borders, but more often operates within the physical borders of the state. And the transnation is that congregation of subjects who circulate around the bordering practices of the state. Now, this picture here demonstrates how the individual subjectivities can be woven into something that looks like a nation, a national identity even, but individually these strands are all very different. So the transnation really celebrates this idea of the circulation around the bordering practices of the state. Now, the transnation develops from the very great sort of dubiousness.
Sir, Professor Ashcroft, sir, your
Yes.
other slides are not visible.
Oh, no.
Yes, it's stuck to the first slide, sir.
Oh, not again.
It happened another time as well, yes.
Oh, for goodness sake. Well,
It is it is there in your side the slide list, but the focusing on the first slide only.
All right. This okay.
You can take a few minutes to undo it, sir. It's no problem. We have a lot of time.
You see the change? Is it changing now?
No, now the presentation has gone off. You have to start presentation again.
Right. Okay. Oh,
Yes.
this is incredibly anticlimactic, isn't it? Okay. Well, I don't know how to.
There are some academics who are commenting that your lecture is mesmerizing even without the slides.
Okay, now. Oh goodness, I'm nearly finished. I wish you'd have told me earlier, but I don't know why this happens. But shall I quickly run through the slides again?
Yes, we have a lot of time.
All right, we're looking at a window.
The present you have to start the presentation again. You have to click on the start. Yes.
Can
Now
you see?
Yes,
now,
we can see the first slide.
If I do that,
Mm-hmm.
Can you see it animated?
Yes, we can. We have gone back to the first slide only.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So, what is post-colonial theory? You can't see that.
Yes. Sir, Nilanjana has come up to help. Nilanjana, you have any help?
Professor, good morning, Professor. Actually, I was thinking if you could, instead of starting the presentation, if you could just manually go through the slides, because last time it worked.
Okay. All right.
I mean, number one, first, if you could share the screen, then number two, without starting, without starting the PPT, if you could manually take us to your slides. Manually. I mean, just highlighting.
Yeah, manually. Okay.
Yes, that would be a good idea.
And I think you are on your slide number 40.
40, right. Okay. Oh, dear.
Screen share first. Screen
All
share.
right. Okay, now if I share this as is, can you see that?
Not yet.
Not yet, sir.
Okay. I'll share it without.
Without starting the PPT. Yes.
Yeah.
Now you have shared the screen. Now, if you could just manually go to
Yes, man. Yes. Now we have come to the slide. What is post-colonial theory?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And then we went through looking at.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
this was the first. Yes.
There
Yes.
must be something about this platform. But okay. So I talked about the growing themes, transnational literatures, transculturalism, and all those things that are becoming a part of post-colonial theory today. And
Right.
I'm interested in the continuing relevance of post-colonial analysis, and what I want to talk about today are how I'm developing post-colonial studies, and that's when I started talking about post-colonial utopianism. And the Utopian Studies Society was formed in 1988 when the Empire Rights Pact was written in 89. And so they have a kind of coeval relationship. Now, can you still see the PowerPoint?
We can see it. We can see it, sir.
Okay.
It's visible.
We can see post-colonial utopianism. Yes.
Good. Well, that's where I talked about the magisterial, the principle of hope, and the contemporary theorist Frederick Jameson. As I said before, these are Marxist utopians, and utopianism has been driven by a combination of Marxism and science fiction. And there's a difference between utopia and utopianism. Utopianism is the spirit of hope. And that is why it's so important in post-colonial writing. The spirit of hope is the spirit that imagines a different kind of future. It's for Sargent, it's social dreaming. For Levitas, the desire of a better way of living expressed in the description of a different kind of society that makes possible a different way of life. So, and again, let me repeat that the anticipatory function of literature is incredibly important to Ernst Bloch. And this makes literature so central to the utopian movement. And it's because it has what he calls Vorschein, foreseeing, or anticipatory illumination, the revelation for of possibilities for rearranging social and political relations to produce Heimat. And Heimat, that home that we have sensed but never experienced or known, that Heimat, that home, it both determines the truth content of a work of art, but most importantly, for Bloch, Heimat always lies beyond the border. And that's where I brought in the next theme of borders and bordering. And borders are incredibly important in organizing the world. What would the world look like without borders, as I said? The borders have grown since the end of World War II. There were 7 border walls then. When Berlin Wall fell, there were 15 border walls, and today there are 77. And as I said before, the most notorious of these is the border wall between the United States and Mexico. And then, but I wanted to delve deeper into this. What is a border? What is a border? And we think of borders as perimeters, as things built around the edge. But in fact, a border is not a thing, but a practice. And bordering practices are both a consequence and a production of power relationships. It's power relationships that establish borders, and it's borders that maintain those power relationships. So borders are extremely important for post-colonial studies, which is from its inception been interested in power relationships, a particular form of power relationship. Now, you wouldn't have seen this, I talked about it, but this is the wall between Israel and Palestine in the West Bank. It was set up by the Israeli government. And the interesting thing about this is the vision of a different kind of world. Is a refusal of the border, that's based on a utopian vision of a different kind of world. And I think this is symbolic. This picture here of a different kind of world is symbolic of the potential for imagining Heimat in post-colonial literatures. The home we've sensed, but not yet experienced. Heimat is incredibly important. And I went through reciting Cavafy's Waiting for the Barbarians, and the point I made about that is that when they found that there were no barbarians, suddenly they panicked. What will become of us without barbarians? So barbarians, those people beyond the border, are necessary because they give us an excuse for the border, and the border tells us who we are. So borders are not just a function of power, but borders are a way in which power maintains its power and maintains its power over identity, particularly national identity, but not only that. So the borders go within, the borders operate within, and the boundary of the state never marks a real exterior. It's a line drawn internally, or lines drawn internally, with a network of institutional mechanisms through which a certain kind of social and political order is maintained. And there are many ways in which these bordering practices operate, through laws, through expectations, and through a sense of what Gramsci calls hegemony, that is, dominance by consent. States rely on their subjects consenting to dominance and maintaining it and reproducing it. So there are 8 borders or boundary markers as criteria for national membership. And I talked about these: national ancestry, national religion, birth on the soil. And of course, all of these represent some sort of ideal national subject. But those people seeking shelter, seeking refuge, people seeking some form of home in the nation state are not considered, according to these borders, not considered to be worth national membership. And so the idea of bordering practices is incredibly important in establishing national identity and the idea of identity itself. And I will recite this. Salman Rushdie, in Step Across This Line, says, "Good writing assumes a frontierless nation. Writers who serve frontiers have become border guards. In our deepest natures, we are frontier-crossing beings. We know this by the stories we tell ourselves, for we are storytelling animals too." And I mentioned that national memory is grounded in history, but the memory of the society, of the culture, is grounded in stories, the stories people tell themselves. And so that idea of the Heimat as not being the nation but the horizon of possibility introduces me to the next concept, the next direction I want to see post-colonial studies moving, and that is the idea of the transnation. Transnation is not the transnational because it can operate within the state as well as beyond it. But the transnation comes about because of the deep post-colonial suspicion of the nation. Wole Soyinka talked about Africa being carved up like some demented tailor who paid no attention to the fabric, colour, pattern of the quilt he was patching together. Now, interestingly enough, the contemporary African states are colonial states. They are occupy the colonial borders. But it's interesting that the post-independence politicians, nobody has tried to weave that quilt by changing the borders. So in a sense, the contemporary post-independence nation is stuck in the boundaries, the borders established by colonialism. Now, the Hobson in his book, Imperialism, suggested that empire-bred nationalism undermines the chance of a true internationalism. And for him, that occurred in two ways. Either, you know, the what he would call good colonies, that is the settler colonies, developed a kind of national feeling. But on the other hand, people whose nationalism developed as an act of resistance also undermined the chance of true internationalism. And Partha Chatterjee has an interesting perspective on this, and he says that nationalism undermines the progress of decolonisation because the national form is hostile to their own cultures. In other words, the national form is not something in nature, you know, it's not something inherent to any society. It's something that developed from the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe. And it has come to define the ways in which the bordering practices of societies are generated. So India is particularly interesting in this because those two great thinkers, Tagore and Gandhi, were adamant in their opposition to nationalism and the critique of the nation state. And in some respects, Gandhi was one of the greatest pure anarchists of our time. But the transnation then, that's the critique of the nation state in particular. The transnation is that fluid migrating outside of the state that begins within the nation. It's a way of talking about subjects who circulate around the bordering practices of the state. So this is bringing together those themes that have been emerging of subjects who circulate around the power, the structures, the bordering practices of the state. Now, there are many ways in which I have theorized this, but I'll just pick one, perhaps the most significant and useful is Deleuze and Guattari's distinction between smooth and striated space. Striated space is simply the warp and woof, the idea of a texture, and it's the way in which governments are organised. Smooth space is like a felt, it's rolled and doesn't really have any striations, any structures. And the point is that the transnation is the smooth space that circulates around the striated space of the nation. Now, Scott aligns this to something he calls infrapolitics, the undramatic, everyday, mundane acts of quiet evasion, slowdowns, false compliance, feigned ignorance and sabotage carried out by factory workers that when performed by many change or alter a landscape of power. Now, you know, a transnation is not necessarily insurgent or rebellious, but because it has the potential to circulate around the bordering practices of the state, of circumventing those bordering practices, it is itself a threat to the power of the state. And so it's interesting to see the ways in which the transnation, which can be composed of people who are entirely law-abiding and committed to the nation itself, by their very existence, they operate as a threat to the bordering practices of the state. And to bring these things together, I want to suggest that the creative spirit is the ultimate border crosser. As Rushdie has suggested, writers are not border guards. Writers are those who continually, because of the power of the imagination, push beyond the borders that are established. They might be conceptual borders, they might be cultural borders, they might be political borders, but the beauty and the power of the creative spirit is that they imagine a world beyond those borders. So utopianism, borders, transnation, the intersection of these concepts is where I want to see, or where I'm taking post-colonial studies today. Thank you.
As I informed earlier, we'll be picking a few questions for Professor Bill Ascroft. We have a few more questions here. First, I would like to request Professor Jyoti Shankar Mandal, Associate Professor of Data Education University, Purulia, ask your question directly to Professor Bill Ascroft. Jyotida, are you here?
Maybe I
yes.
can ask my question.
Okay,
I
ma'am.
have
Okay. Please take your question.
Professor, I have a question. Before that, I just want to say hi to Fiona. It's good to see you. Professor Ashcroft, you were talking about borders, and I found that very, very interesting because in India, we have been till today facing the aftermath of a severe and possibly the most neurotic partition ever. Now, our partitions have been marked by barbed wires. Yet when I have visited them quite a few times, I have found that there are little boys from Bangladesh or Pakistan who come into the Indian borders with packs full of apples and sugar, and they go back. So the border is pretty porous. Some people come to work by day and return by night. So that is the kind of a physical demarcation of the barbed wire. But what about the psychological demarcation? Because in Punjab and in West Bengal, the topos of East Bengal and West Bengal is still marked on the psyche. Even today, some marriages do not take place if you belong to East or West Bengal. What would you say to this physical and psychological bordering?
Well, that's a very appropriate question. You know, it's a similar thing in Africa, where the borders of the state are entirely porous, and people move across them in you know, the daily life all the time. But the borders have a very powerful function. Now, in the border between Bengal and West Bengal, or Bangladesh and West Bengal, the psychological power of this is immense. So it shows two things. It shows the mobility of the transnation, because the transnation can move around and beyond those borders, but it also shows the psychological power of those bordering practices. The bordering practices are not simply line, fence drawn. The bordering practices are the practices by which identity is controlled. And that has, you know, the powers of being in all kinds of things like religion, culture, politics to create borders that convince people that their identity is constructed by those borders. Now, what I think the positive and perhaps utopian possibility of those people moving back and forth across the borders is that the borders are porous, and particularly with the creative imagination, those borders can be crossed, and crossed with a view of a different kind of world.
Thank you so much, Professor. This is the question
Professor
that...
Jyoti Shankar Mandal, I request you to ask your question directly.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Good afternoon, Professor Ashcroft. My question is that when you are speaking about bordering practices, it's almost a kind of refusal to the borders. Then my question is, what happens to in case of transnationality when we are speaking about so many hyphenated identities, Malayan, Fijian, Indian? What happens in that case?
Well, firstly, when I talk about transnation, I'm not talking about necessarily transnationalism, but the transnationalism is a function of the mobility of subjects, okay? And that mobility is always confined by the bordering practices of states, not just their physical borders, but by the psychological, political, and cultural borders. And so what we see in what you call hyphenated identities is people who have the capacity to cross those borders. They have the capacity to do it, but very often they're caught in the hyphen. And the hyphen cannot provide an adequate description of the fluidity and mobility of the of identity in the world. So what you have is there's this constant tension between the mobility of people, the fluidity of identity, and the bordering practices of the state, which are, in short, the reason that those identities are hyphenated. Now, I think, we should do away with the hyphen. We started with a hyphen in post-colonial, but that kept confusing people who thought it meant after colonialism. So we got rid of the hyphen. And perhaps we should get rid of the hyphen in transnational movements.
Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Unmute yourself, please. Professor Malik, unmute yourself.
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question for you, sir, by KRSPL. I didn't read out the full name of the person. So here I read out this question on his behalf. Nobel Prize winner Rabindranath Tagore said that a feeling of nationalism can be detrimental to world peace. Dr. Bill, do you seem to reflect a similar view? Nobel Prize winner Rabindranath Tagore said that the feeling of nationalism can be detrimental to world peace. And he asked, he questioned you, do you think the reflect to similar same thing in your eye? What about your opinion?
Well, it's absolutely right. Nationalism is a threat to world peace. I want to suggest something even more troubling, and that is nationalism and genocide go hand in hand. And nationalism and racism go hand in hand. So nationalism is not just love for one's country. Nationalism is about some very severe bordering practices. And nationalism and the kind of populist nationalism that's being promoted by politicians today is extremely detrimental to world peace. And I think that it demonstrates the urgency of ordinary people sort of overcoming the strictures and bordering practices of the state. But also, it does give us hope that the capacity of artists and writers to imagine a different kind of world, a world beyond national identity, is possible. Behind that, that is not bounded by national borders. That, I think, is the utopian hope that I have for literature. But it doesn't alter the fact that national identity is a very, very handy thing for politicians. National identity is a way to keep power. Fear of the other is a way to keep power. And the acceptance of the other, which in Kant's terms is the essence of cosmopolitanism, is a way in which a world can be shared. Now, I have a few sort of doubts about cosmopolitanism because it's a very wide term and it's very open to people who can move. But the ethical basis of cosmopolitanism is one that jumps beyond the bordering practices of the state and of national identity. And I think this is the way in which the world can see a different kind of future. You know, it may be utopian, but it's up to those people, imaginative artists and writers, to conceive it. Because nothing is achieved unless it's first imagined. And we need to imagine a world where nationalism and genocide, nationalism and racism are abolished.
Thank you very much, participants, and Professor Bill Ascop. Here we just wind up the whole question answer session. Over to Professor Sarvani Banerjee to sum up the session and move forward for next.
Sir, you said that borders are necessary, and yet nationalism is detrimental for national health. So how, and since there are more than 77 borders today, and border skirmishes are the reality, if we do away with the sense of nationalism and nation state, as Tagore advocated, do you think that borders will vanish in a perfect utopia?
In a perfect utopia, they would. But, you know, borders will vanish when power vanishes. Borders are instituted and maintained by power relationships. And that's where the problem lies. It's in the power relationships that bordering practices set up in order to organise people's sense of who they are. And that's where the real danger is. What writers give us is a potential to see ourselves beyond those borders, beyond those strictures. Now, you know, I don't have any very optimistic things to say about nations and borders and international peace. But what I would emphasize now is that the capacity of the imagination through the creative spirit is one thing that can show us the way to a different kind of world. Thank you.
Ma'am, may I just add to your question? Hello?
Shivani?
Sarvanaji, please unmute yourself. You are muted. No
Yes,
one can listen to
sorry.
you.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
sorry, Nilanjana. Most welcome to ask your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Actually, I wanted Professor to have a bit of voice rest. I had a lot of questions, so I just write it for him personally. But, ma'am, because you know your question actually triggered a question in me. Rather, it's a sort of possibility which I have seen in the present virtual camaraderie that has taken place due to this pandemic crisis. Here we have observed the entire world mourning for George Floyd. So maybe this virtual camaraderie is slowly trying to wipe at least this everyday borderings. I mean, Professor, do you look at this as a sort of a new possibility towards a sort of borderless world? Thank you.
I do. Now, I'd have to say that America has led the world in racism, and America's problems are grounded not just in racism, but in slavery. And slavery is the thing that generates inequality. Slavery is the thing that has, even centuries later, prohibited people from voting. And this is something that's now being faced. And I think the murder of George Floyd is a kind of trigger point for people, that the response to that was global. And I see that as something that gives us hope. Gives us hope. People are not going to put up with racism, inequality, slavery anymore. The violence of power continues, and it's up to individuals. The trans nation, I heard a very interesting statement, that is, protest is the voice of the unheard. So the unheard need to protest, and that protest can generate waves and ripples throughout the world. So yeah, I think that we may possibly be seeing, at a time when our political leaders seem to be at their worst, this is also a time where there is greatest hope of people overcoming things such as racism and the violence against people of.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Kumaresan, Assistant Professor of Vivekananda College, Madurai, asks a very, very interesting and a rather a personal question. He says, Dr. Bill, your lecture is outstanding. How do you prepare and plan for your lectures? Especially the present one is so seamless. Ideas are so well connected. Now, we would all like to know that.
Well, a lecture such as this has taken half a lifetime to prepare for. It's taken 3 books, and I prepare it. Yeah, I mean, thanks. It's very complimentary what you say, but I have certain passions that that underpin all my preparation for these things. Passion for justice, for equality, passion for liberation and freedom. And so keeping these things in mind, that's the thing that generate what I come out with, what I say. But I'm always looking for the way ahead, the ways in which we can push this field. And I hope this gives some idea of certain ways in which it can be done.
Thank you so much, sir. We have kept to our promise of 1 hour.
Well, yeah, 1 hour, 10 minutes.
Just a few minutes extra, I think. Thank you so much. I mean, thank you is actually too small a word for the great warmth that we feel within our hearts. You do not know how many young hearts you have enkindled by your talk. Thank you so much. And we will keep, irritating you over the mail to find out some possible direction at any other time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will now request Professor Orunima Kormakar, Associate Professor, Assistant Professor of TDP College, to welcome our next speaker, Fiona McCann. Hello, Fiona. Good to see you.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Arunima, are you here?
Yeah, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Let's.
Sorry, your
Well,
camera is.
Camera, rotate your camera. Rotate your camera.
Rotate your camera, please.
is it
Yes,
okay now?
that's
Yes.
perfect.
Actually,
Yes.
That's right.
my laptop is not working, so I had to manage somehow with my mobile phone.
Okay.
Okay. Good afternoon, ma'am. This is. I take the proud privilege to welcome our next speaker, who's Fiona McCann, presently working as a professor of post-colonial literature at the University of Lille, France. The title of her doctoral thesis is History and Stories in the Fiction of Yuval Beha and Joy Wickham, Palimpsest Identities Hybridity. She has worked as a certified teacher and lecturer in various prestigious academic institutions. She was a lecturer teaching English for the non-specialized specialist in the University of Caen and Maranula Valley. She was a lecturer in studies on women, sex, and gender at the University of Lille. She has published numerous papers and articles in various national and international journals. She has written the English translation of the French novel Mutate by Sauce Leonard. She holds prestigious positions in numerous literary and academic institutions like Post-Colonial Studies Association, International Association for the Study of Irish Literature, etc., to name only a few. Today, she will speak on the topic Border Poetics in Contemporary English and Indian Literature, Arundhati Roy and Mia Gallagher. Ma'am, please deliver your lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very warm welcome. And really, it's just such a huge honor to be able to participate in this webinar today. It's very hard following on after Bill, so please bear with me. But I think that in some ways what I'm going to say kind of follows on from some of the things that Bill was talking about, because my talk is going to engage with the question of nationalisms, plural, and borders. So I'm not sure that I'm sketching out any new avenues at all in post-colonial studies, but these are some of the questions that I'm interested in right now. So I suppose the best place for me to start is to address the elephant in the room, which is what on earth could Ireland and India possibly have in common apart from similar colours in their respective flags? But as Nicholas Green pointed out way back in 2007, and I quote him here, Ireland and India, well, one is very small, a westerly island off the coast of Europe. The other occupies most of an Asian subcontinent. The population of one is 4.2 million, the other 1.1 billion. This is back in 2007, right? So the figures aren't exactly right. He goes on, there are two national languages in Ireland, only one of which most of its citizens can speak fluently. That language is English. There are 22 official languages in India, not to mention at least 18 other unofficial ones, each spoken by 5 million people. Ireland and India are both republics and, yes, he concludes, they were both once parts of the British Empire. End of quote. Now, he doesn't mention partition, but that's also the big linking factor too between Ireland and India. So Green goes on to say that the history of contacts, interactions, and comparison between the two countries is rich and complex, and the interrelated colonial and post-colonial stories of Ireland and India prove to be fascinatingly comparable, both in their similarities and their differences. Now, the aim of today's talk is not actually to go over the rich and intertwined histories of post-colonial India and Ireland. Plenty of scholars have already done this before me. And I decided not to do a PowerPoint because I was worried about the technical glitches that could occur. but I can send a bibliography afterwards if anybody's interested in that. So although I am myself, personally speaking, a fervent defender of Ireland's post-colonial status, I say this because Ireland is often ignored in the field of post-colonial studies, and indeed the debate around Ireland's post-coloniality is quite an ugly one in Ireland itself. But although I am a defender of this status, the neoliberal agenda, which has been rampantly pursued by various governments, really since the 1960s and more so since the 1990s and the Celtic Tiger, dependent as this has been on direct and indirect exploitation of workers in other countries and indeed in Ireland, I think disqualifies Ireland from the term post-colonial in this ultra-contemporary period. Of course, this is a vexed question because the north of Ireland is still, to all intents and purposes, a colony. So it renders the whole post-colonial debate in Ireland complex. And I'd also like to acknowledge, and I think it's very important to acknowledge that one of the reasons why Ireland has kind of been excluded from post-colonial debates is because the Irish, as you know, I suppose Britain's first colony, participated in colonization were part of settler colonial groups in Australia and Canada, in various African countries, and so on. It's complex, is the kind of long and short of this. But I'm suggesting that the term post-colonial is complex in a context of rampant neoliberalism. And I would say that the same arguments are valid for contemporary India, and the rise of a certain kind of extremist nationalism, very repressive responses to any sort of unrest or resistance, whether in territorial or in environmental disputes. And indeed, the two often go together. And for more on this, I recommend, of course, Arundhati Roy's Capitalism, a Ghost Story. So in this talk today, I'm more interested in gathering together a number of strands in order to tease out some ideas related to the establishment of two authors, Arundhati Roy on the one hand and Mia Gallagher, who probably nobody here has ever heard of. She's not very well known. But I'm looking at how these two authors establish what I'm going to call a border poetics. And so in order to do this, I'm going to rely a little bit on some decolonial theory by Walter Mignolo, some recent border theory by Thomas Neal, and some queer theory, notably by Jack Halberstam. But I'm also inevitably, given the contexts of the two novels that I'll be analysing, I'm also going to be investigating the representation of violence and various forms of terrorism, which I'm putting in scare quotes here, because in these novels, terrorist acts are carried out both by militant freedom fighters and the state. So you might already be thinking that these four strands, decolonial theory, borders, terrorism, and queer bodies, are strange bedfellows, and they are. But I'm going to try and see how these authors play with physical, geographical, gender, and generic borders in quite similar ways. And in doing this, so the agenda, if you like, behind all of this by these authors is to invite reflection on globalization and the ways in which it rhymes with the destruction of natural resources, territorial invasions and usurpations, the marginalization of queers, and the policing of non-normative behaviors. So quite coincidentally, Arundhati Roy published her long-awaited second novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, in 2017, just a few short months after Irish author Mia Gallagher published her second novel, Beautiful Pictures of the Lost Homeland, in 2016. Both novelists had produced other work in between the publication of their first and second novels. I don't need to tell anybody here about the extent of non-fiction, for example, that Arundhati Roy has produced, and Gallagher had produced a number of short stories. What's interesting to me is that both these novels have as their central character a transgender woman, the Hijra Anjem in Ministry, and Geo, formerly Georgie, in Beautiful Pictures. These central characters are, however, somewhat displaced during the course of each narrative, decentered, as it were. And I think that this is very much in keeping with the political agendas of the authors. Other characters come to the fore. Both novels are very concerned with state and individual acts of terrorism and with the troubles engendered by territorial land claims. And it's in this that I think part of this talk will resonate with what Bill was saying there about nationalism and violence, really. Both novels delight in foregrounding temporal and spatial slippage, making the reader work very hard to keep up. And both accentuate interstitial spaces, reconfiguring them and rendering them less marginal. Graveyards and lanes loom large in these novels. So Arundhati Roy may only have written 2 novels, but she is the author of 14 essays and several interviews. These essays are all highly political, ranging from severe criticism of India's development of nuclear power, to that of global capitalism, to a defense of Kashmiri independence, to opposition to US imperialism, and to support of Palestinian resistance to Israeli colonization, oppression, and human rights abuses. Because she speaks so vociferously on these questions, she has been labeled with, or she's been saddled with the label political writer. And this is always meant in a negative sense. The idea is somehow that fiction and the aesthetics of literary works have become subordinated to political activism and politics more generally. And I think this is a way of dismissing her as a writer of fiction. But if we follow French philosopher Jacques Rancière, then I think we can see that literature is inherently political. As soon as one puts pen to paper, even if it's a very basic sentence, it's already political. And although Rancière cautions against the idea that literature or art might lead people to change their ways, because he's very lucid about the fact that it doesn't, he does suggest that a reconfiguration of the sensible is possible through literature, notably by bringing into being what has previously been invisible and inaudible. So the Ministry of Utmost Happiness has a much more complex structure than Arundhati Roy's first novel. We might want to reduce it to the stories of Anjum and Tylo, but this would be, I think, to miss out on the complexities of the novel. It's deliberately unwieldy. It's purposely confusing for the Western reader in particular, who might be familiar, in fact, who's probably unfamiliar with the intricacies of various political and economic situations in India. It's much less of a textbook post-colonial novel like The God of Small Things was, and it's more of a generic anomaly. There's a very obvious incorporation of practically every single important political and economic event in late 20th and early 21st century India. I suppose starting from the emergency in 1975 onwards, the Bhopal disaster in 1984 is represented, Kashmiri conflict from the late 1980s, the Naxalite Maoist insurgency, to name but these, and there are others. So much so that the novel has been somewhat negatively reviewed and has left reviewers quite perplexed. Some have called it a fascinating mess. Others, not to name him, but Alex Clark in The Guardian calls it a curious beast, baggy, bewilderingly overpopulated with characters, written in an often careless and haphazard style. Eileen Battersby, who passed away last year, the reviewer in the Irish Times, was perhaps among the most scathing. She concludes, after reading The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, I quote, "Within pages of this messy and superficial but good-natured narrative, a sensation of déjà vu takes over. It becomes apparent that Roy is gamely striving for a Rushdie-like concoction while failing to replicate his trademark bombastic flourish. Everything is obvious in The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. The kindest comment to make about this formless, overhyped, and conventional performance is that reading it is comparable to spending years knitting a giant sweater only to discover that it actually has 3 sleeves. Ouch." I don't need to probably tell anybody here that a good deal of controversy has also surrounded the publication of this novel, partly because Arundhati Roy acknowledges at the end, in a very long acknowledgement section, a debt owed to Dayanita Singh, who clearly facilitated a source of inspiration for the character of Anjum. So Singh, as most people know, I'm sure, is a photographer interested in creating book objects and has published several of them. And some recent works include mobile museums which circulate and allow her work to be presented and configured differently each time, thereby generating multiple possibilities. But one of Singh's best known photographic subjects was Mona Ahmed, who died in September 2017 at the age of 81. And Ahmed was perhaps India's best known transgender woman. From Delhi, she too, like the character in the novel, lived in a graveyard in Old Delhi, which became home to sex workers, the homeless, and beggars for over 3 decades. So the problem is that Mona Ahmed is not actually acknowledged by Roy for herself. So I'm going to look at the agenda behind the choice of a transgender individual as a main character in just a second. But for now, I'd just like to remind us that we should bear in mind that this novel was published 3 years after a landmark ruling by the Supreme Court of India declaring transgender people to be a third gender, and significantly 70 years exactly after Indian independence. An independence, as we know, which saw the country partitioned, sundered, with all the violent fallout that partitions always cause. I'm thinking here also of Ireland and Palestine. So there's no doubt that the novel is intended as a comment on the state of the nation between the emergency in 1975, really right up until 2017. So it, overviews about 40 odd years of contemporary Indian history. So we might want to question how useful the term post-colonial is to define a novel which deals really mostly with India's internal turmoil, the rise of far-right nationalism, the embracing of neoliberalism, the advocacy of nuclear weapons, the destruction of the environment. What is significant, I think, and this responds in some ways to what Bill was saying, what is significant is the way in which Arundhati Roy presents competing nationalisms in different ways, giving the lie to the usual dismissal of all nationalisms as inherently negative or violent. So while far-right nationalism is presented as barbaric, sometimes supremacist, sectarian and violent, Kashmiri nationalism, for all that it is also extremely violent, is couched in different terms as a kind of an emancipatory nationalism coming up against the powerful Indian nation state, which swallows up dissensus. So to go back to Rancière then, this is a novel all about dissensus, so much that it defies categorization. It completely celebrates its own unwieldiness as alternate strands of stories collide rather than complement each other. In a similar manner then, Mia Gallagher, this Irish author, and her novel Beautiful Pictures of the Lost Homeland also disrupts novelistic norms and is just as unwieldy. It has also been reviewed by various critics as sloppy, messy, exactly the same kind of vocabulary that we see being deployed in the reviews of Arundhati Roy's novel. And just as Roy's novel nods to the Supreme Court decision in India to recognise transgender as a third gender, so too Mia Gallagher's novel resonates with the 2015 Gender Recognition Act in Ireland, which allows all individuals over the age of 18 to self-declare their own gender identity. And indeed, young people aged 16 to 17 can also now apply to be legally recognised, although the process is a little more onerous. So for a country which only decriminalised homosexuality in 1993 and divorce in 1995, it's not bad going. Now, Mia Gallagher couldn't have known as she was writing this novel that Brexit was about to become much more than a UKIP fantasy, and that the fragile peace process in the north of Ireland would be tested as the physically invisible Irish border threatens to become very visible once again, despite the wishes of the majority of Irish people. But it is coincidental that her novel should be so obsessed with borders, particularly the troubles engendered by the Irish border, which many Irish writers tend to ignore. And just as we were asking ourselves whether post-colonial novel is the most felicitous term for Roy's novel, which is so Indo-centric, one might well ask the same question of Gallagher's novel, much of which is focused on shifting borders in Central Europe, notably in and around Bohemia. In fact, both these novels show, I think, the limits of the post-colonial label and suggest perhaps that an engagement with decolonial politics and aesthetics might be a fruitful approach. And perhaps this is a case of theory catching up with literary practice once again. So a few words then on decoloniality. Walter Mignolo and Rolando Vasquez, in their introduction to a recent issue of Social Text on decolonial aesthetics, explain their terminology, what they call modernity stroke decoloniality. And the D is in brackets. They describe it in this way, I quote, "They," so these terms, "are a signpost of conflicting enunciations. The rhetoric of modernity and its continuing promises of salvation, and the logic of coloniality, the continuing hidden process of expropriation, exploitation, pollution, and corruption that underlies the narrative of modernity, as promoted by institutions and actors belonging to corporations, industrialized nation states, museums, and research institutions. Decoloniality," they say, "appears between modernity and coloniality as an opening, as a possibility of overcoming their completeness and their totalizing discourses. Decoloniality refers to the variegated enunciations springing from global local histories entangled with the local imperial history of Euro-American modernity, postmodernity, and alter-modernity." So if we're going to speak of Arundhati Roy's and Mia Gallagher's novels within the framework of globalization, then I would like to suggest that they are decolonial in their aesthetics. Both are full of radical critique of both politics and the arts, and both sketch out a space for marginality, liminality, and interestingly, even failure. These novels are full of decolonial subjects and subjectivities. So moving on now to the question of liminal spaces and marginal bodies, both novels make abundant use of liminal spaces. Anjum, once she leaves the already liminal space of the Quagba, a safe home for hijras, sets up home in a graveyard, and Geo spends most of her time as a child in the lane which runs behind her Dublin house. The graveyard in Roy's novel clearly stands for contemporary India. It's a strong signifier of death, gesturing towards the death of post-independence hopes, the rotting of an ideal, but also of the ghosts which continue to haunt contemporary India, the legacy of British occupation, the advent of neoliberal economics, and indeed the presence of US intelligence. But it's not just this. The graveyard is not just a symbol, since indeed this graveyard in real life with Mona Abed becomes reconfigured, a reconfigured space on the margins, both literally and figuratively, a space which welcomes marginal figures of all sorts. Now it gradually expands over the course of the novel, swells so as to accommodate shelter, all sorts of modcoms, even a swimming pool, and indeed a form of osmosis with the departed. The graveyard, as it swells, becomes described as having different cell-like structures, which suggests that independence and autonomy are possible. But these cell-like structures are built over graves, where past and present are intertwined. And it seems to me that there's also a certain irony if we take into consideration grave as an adjective as opposed to the noun, since grave, connotes something which is serious, solemn, sober, maybe even dull. And if indeed there is a serious edge to Anjum's creation of a safe space in the graveyard in which to harbour marginals, there's absolutely nothing sober or dull about it. It's quite the contrary, and quite the motley crew. So that's one, that's the, I suppose, marginal space in Roy's novel. In Mia Gallagher's novel, the lane behind Geo's house is where she meets what much later turns out to be an imaginary friend, Elaine, interestingly named, Elaine, who is an ugly, emaciated and undernourished girl who has been abandoned by her parents and left to fend for herself. The symbolism is, I think, obvious. Geo, who feels desperately unhappy in the body of her assigned gender, male, befriends this waif, nourishing her in secret, clothing her as best she can, and educating her. This same lane is the scene of a later confrontation of heteronormative patriarchy and queer divergence when Geo goes back to visit it on a whim as a trans woman. The scene juxtaposes her observation of a group of youths flirting with each other, heterosexual youths, and acting out according to heteronormative expectations, and her reminiscence of a conversation with her former lover, Mar. The passage is much too long to quote, but I will just quote the way in which the youths are described as they arrive. So I quote, "The sharks and the jets, a gang of boys coming from the lane, a pack of girls heading up from the green. The boys were lanky and spotty, the girls luscious and dolled up, faces painted, bodies poured into spray-on jeans and fluoro tops. One of Macker's friends had just grabbed him, started wrestling the Coke bottle from him. They got into a headlock, cheers, jeers, giggles from the girls." End of quote. This performance of heteronormativity is shown as precisely that. Geo, who's narrating this scene, borrows from generic stereotype and popular culture, West Side Story, with the sharks and the jets. The girls are dolled up, suggesting their potential objectification. Their faces are painted, as in a kind of performance. The boys tussle over the phallic Coke bottle, and this neatly dovetails this very heteronormative performance. And it is that, since the girls cheer, and there's that lovely alliteration and consonance there at the end. So it is definitely a heteronormative performance, but the Coke bottle allows this to be dovetailed with neoliberal capitalism and monopoly. Even the very syntax of the first part of the quotation, with its balanced binary phrasing, the girls come this way, the boys come this way, works to reinforce binary gender oppositions. Fearful of a transphobic attack, Geo is hiding in a nearby hedge, and one of the girls sees her through it and calls her a pervert. Now, juxtaposed and indeed interweaved into this episode are a series of memories of Geo's time with her lover, Mar, and her body's changing state as she was undergoing the transition process. In one of these memories, she remembers Mar recoiling as he brushes his chin against her breasts, which are still at this point covered in stubble. Initially embarrassed, she ends up laughing too at what she calls her jelly tots, jelly tits in a sea of stubble, unquote. The passage ends up with her musing over Mar's desire to be, quote, a family man, even if that family was just the two of us, him and me, end of quote. Now, the fact that these memories are coming to her as she stands in the lane, this interstitial space, observing the group of young heterosexual people is significant. This lane, then, this in-between space, is where heteronormative and non-heteronormative existences collide. And what appears monstrous here, notwithstanding what the girl says when she calls Geo a pervert, is in fact heteronormativity, with its pretenses, its performances, its embedded violence, its over-the-topness, and its vulgarity. Geo's colourful image of her anatomy and her tender recall of her relationship with Mar provide a reconfiguration of marginality, bringing it into the mainstream and overtly celebrating a failure to conform. So, moving on then from the question of liminal spaces to the question of border politics, a significant part of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness concerns the territorial war over the Kashmir Valley, while Beautiful Pictures of the Lost Homeland devotes considerable attention to the shifting borders around Bohemia and on the island of Ireland from the Middle Ages onwards. This interest in borders, barriers, and the limits of territories is to be linked to both authors' interest in queering the pitch and offering a decolonial perspective on Indian and European history. All of this, in other words, is interlinked. There are, apart from the interstitial spaces that we've mentioned, there are other improbable spaces and contested spaces, indeed, in these novels. The contested space of the Kashmir Valley in Ministry, and the even more improbable space of what is called the Wunderkammer in Beautiful Pictures, which I'll explain in just a moment. All of these places are decentered, they are marginal, and they are a means of exposing how borders function, and also how they are evidence, as Thomas Nail would have it, of kenopolitics. So for Thomas Nail, And I really recommend reading his two of his books, in fact, A Theory of the Border and The Figure of the Migrant, for anybody that's interested in border studies. But he says, I quote, "Since the border is always in between and in motion, it is a constantly changing process. Borders are never done including someone or something. This is the case not only because borders regularly change their selection process of inclusion. This is not only the case because empirically borders are at the outskirts of society and within it, but because they regularly change their selection process of inclusion such that anybody might be expelled at any moment." So in Mia Gallagher's novel, this Wunderkammer is like a literary aesthetic companion piece to Nail's work on borders. It's very hard to describe. It's an ambulant, interactive museum, not fixed in any particular time space, a potentially dangerous experience, and it exposes no artwork. It is in fact first described at the beginning of the novel in this way, and I quote, "Like all lost territories, this space refuses to answer to a single name. Terms such as Kunstkabinet, Wunderkammer, Sondersammlung, Theatre of Memory, Cabinet of Curiosities, and Picture House of Intriguing Objects will pop up from time to time as monikers. Please regard these, to all intents and purposes, as interchangeable." This is not history, her story in any factual sense, but like all art cabinets, a stab at creating a semblance of order out of chaos via subjective choices. We wonder, does every ripple of history have the same source? Boom. If her story is a wave, what is the medium through which it ripples? Can waves of a specific our story and its variants, history, her story, their story, your story, a story, as well as the Holy Grail, the story, ripple through other mediums? And crucially, what happens when we meet a medium's end? So the log notes from which this extract is taken are disseminated throughout the novel, seemingly randomly, and narrated by a depersonified first-person plural narrator, a sort of disembodied curator of sorts. They relate the material history of Bohemia, later Sudetenland, often linking it to Ireland, and the experience is olfactory, visual, and kinesthetic, even in fact physical when parts of it blow up. And this is, of course, symbolic of the explosive nature of the kinds of curiosities found inside. But what this introduction to the Wunderkammer foregrounds is the subjectivity of museums and the potential violence in the use of the word stab in that description I just read, the multiple versions of history always at play, and the domination of certain histories over others, and the mediums or frequencies through which these histories reach us are all broached in this section. The log notes, in fact, serve as a backstory for Lotte and Anna Bauer, two characters in the novel. Lotte is a young English hippie who actually is a home help in Gio's family when her mother is dying of cancer. And her mother, Anna, is a German Sudetenland survivor of World War II who flees to Britain after the war and who is being interviewed for a television documentary about that experience of migration. So as you can see, it's an extremely complex novel. Often facetious in tone, these log notes disseminated throughout the novel begin with maps. In this way, the Wunderkammer resonates from the beginning, from the very first map, described as the Urkarte, the original of the species, short on political borderlines, heavy on topographical features. So it resonates from the beginning with Nail's words quoted above about borders regularly changing their selection process. Thomas Nail, in both of his books, is in fact at pains to show that borders, contrary to popular thinking, are not binary. Instead of, he says, instead of dividing into two according to the static logic of sovereign binarism, the border divides by movement and multiplication. Later, the log notes emphasize this in their presentation of 20th century history in Central Europe and the disputing parties among Czechs and Germans, linking them to their Irish counterparts. So connections are made throughout between shifting borders in Europe and shifting borders in Ireland. After one of the final log notes turns into what is called a musical Schattenspiel, as boundaries shift and morph between 1914 and 1933, Log Note 9 is another form of entertainment with 5 acts and a finale which recounts, I quote, the subordination of the Sudeten borderlands to Reich policies through to the final liberation of Czechoslovakia by the Red Guard and the Czech militias, culminating in a rousing group photo of the expulsions of 1945, at which point the entire German population of the Sudetenland, as if by magic, disappears. Now, this flippant tone, which you can perceive in the quotation that I just gave you, dominates throughout these log notes, and euphemisms abound. Given the extreme violence of this history, we all know now about the mass rape of German women on the border, other forms of sexual assault and incest, individual and group acts of terror. So given our shared knowledge of this flippant tone, so far from the ostensibly neutral and informative tone of most museums, in fact increases the horror because of the disjuncture. Presenting the conflicting loyalties at stake in a given territory and the forced expulsion of German Sudetens as a form of entertainment enables Mia Gallagher to deliver a scathing criticism of border politics as understood by Wendy Brown, who says, I quote, "Political walls have always spectacularized power. They have always generated performance and symbolic effects in excess of their obdurately material ones," unquote. So while there is some humor in Mia Gallagher's novel, there is very little humor in Roy's representation of both the Kashmir conflict and the Maoist Naxalite insurgency, both of which occupy a substantial part of the second half of the novel. Now, Roy has commented at length on these in her book, Capitalism, a Ghost Story, but in Ministry, she incorporates both of these into the complex narrative of the nation, in which she opens up spaces for dissensus. The territorial dispute over Kashmir is accompanied, in fact, even mirrored by ideological lines. I quote, "As the war went on, in the valley, the soft line gradually hardened and the hard line further hardened. Each line begot more lines and sublines," end of quote. So there's a sort of biblical begetting foregrounded here. And in fact, Roy does a wonderful job of conveying the incremental radicalization of the citizens of the region. So I'm just going to quote a short passage from the novel. "Martyrdom stole into the Kashmir Valley from across the line of control through moonlit mountain passes manned by soldiers. Night after night, it walked on narrow, stony paths, wrapped like thread around blue cliffs of ice, across vast glaciers and high meadows of waist-deep snow. It trudged past young boys shot down in snowdrifts, their bodies arranged in eerie, frozen tableau under the pitiless gaze of the pale moon in the cold night sky, and stars that hung so low you felt you could almost touch them. When it arrived in the valley, it stayed close to the ground and spread through the walnut groves, the saffron fields, the apple, almond, and cherry orchards like a creeping mist. It whispered words of war into the ears of doctors and engineers, students and labourers, tailors and carpenters, weavers and farmers, shepherds, cooks, and bards. They listened carefully and then put down their books and implements, their needles, their chisels, their staffs, their ploughs, their cleavers, and their spangled clown costumes, etc., etc. Okay, so then they basically begin to engage in violence. So the passage is too long really to do much justice to in this short time in terms of analysis, but I would just note the personification here of really incremental violence, the incorporation of fable. We notice elements of the pastoral here, but of course also of the Gothic. This is presented as a kind of creeping contagion. We have a sense of temporal stasis, the representation of all members of the villages, all kinds of professions. The bounty of the land is emphasized, the attention paid to hands and ears, and all of this is juxtaposed to the final blood-curdling implications of the final sentence, which I will read you now. Only after they had been given guns of their own, only after they had curled their fingers around the trigger and felt it give ever so slightly, after they had weighted the odds and decided it was a viable option, only then did they allow the rage and shame of the subjugation they had endured for decades, for centuries, to course through their bodies and turn the blood in their veins into smoke. So Roy obviously here is describing lines close to the line of control, and the metaphor of the mist, I think, here enhances the porosity of that border in spite of all the attempts to partition and divide. As Thomas Nail has pointed out, I quote, "Barbed wire has become an almost universal symbol of political violence, nationalism, and oppression. In many instances, those using barbed wire may even intend for the wire to summon this historical and violent meaning." In fact, Roy presents the line of control as directly murderous. I quote, "In remote border areas near the line of control, the speed and regularity with which bodies turned up and the condition some of them were in wasn't easy to cope with. Some were delivered in sacks, some in small polythene bags, just pieces of flesh, some hair and teeth," unquote. The passive constructions here, at odds with the initial agency of the bodies and the deliberate understatement, "not easy to cope with," all testify to the brutal fallout of territorial disputes and the constant threat of violence. The agents of torture and murder are never identified. They could in fact almost be the mist. Wendy Brown cogently suggests that, I quote, "As a boundary marker that is also a form of power, sovereignty bears two different faces. These appear in two different dictionary meanings of sovereignty, supremacy and autonomy, and two equally discrepant political usages, as decisive power or rule and as freedom from occupation by another," unquote. The valley presented here has only limited autonomy and is very much under the yoke of Indian supremacy. But Roy, and I think this is a very interesting point, makes sure not to sugarcoat actions carried out by the insurgents either. And this also, I think, accounts for the elided agents in the passage that I quoted above. This same illusion of agency is present in the opening chapter of Beautiful Pictures by Mia Gallagher. This opening chapter is the description of the moments preceding a suicide bomb attack in the London Underground, told in a first-person plural voice. The proximity of all of those squashed into the tube carriage is rendered through a series of synecdoches. I quote, for example, "the millimetre-thin membrane between arse and cock, tit and elbow, mouth and forehead. We drink in each other's scent," unquote. And this, I think, also already announces the porosity of boundaries, which will be explored in so many other ways in the novel. There are enough clues present to guess by the end of the novel who the individual perpetrator is, but the opening passage interestingly privileges a collective rather than an individual act, thereby, I think, inviting us to tackle questions of terrorism differently and see them in a context of global geopolitics. Nothing is sugarcoated here. There are no easily identifiable goodies and baddies. Border politics are world politics. So while Roy and Gallagher tackle this border politics in different ways, using very different tones, they convey a similar point. Borders as expressions of national sovereignty exert both centrifugal and centripetal control of movement. And one quotation from Roy's novel, I think, illustrates this beautifully. I quote, "Tourists flew out, journalists flew in, honeymooners flew out, soldiers flew in," unquote. So there is this centrifugal and centripetal control of movement and constant movement even when the border appears static over decades. In fact, the more the walls or borders are reinforced, the more waning the sovereignty of the state concerned is. So I'm moving now towards my conclusion, but I wanted to say something a little bit more optimistic and not end on such a negative note. And so I see a potentially more optimistic way of reading these novels and an attempt, I suppose, to bring together, or through an attempt to bring together the queer and decolonial strands of these texts and link them to the question of border politics. So Jack Halberstam, when he was still writing under the name of Judith, has made a thought-provoking case for thinking differently about failure as a means of resistance to our neoliberal world. Now, he starts out with an explanation of how the cartoon SpongeBob SquarePants and the film Little Miss Sunshine present compelling arguments for celebrating failure. And he suggests that, I quote, "academic, activists, artists, and cartoon characters have long been on a quest to articulate an alternative vision of life, love, and labour, and to put such a vision into practice. He argues that success in a heteronormative capitalist society equates too easily to specific forms of reproductive maturity combined with wealth accumulation. And after noting that, I quote, failing is something that queers do and have always done exceptionally well, unquote, he goes on to ask, what kinds of reward can failure offer us? Perhaps most obviously, failure allows us to escape the punishing norms that discipline behaviour and manage human development with the goal of delivering us from unruly childhoods to orderly and predictable adulthoods. Failure preserves some of the wondrous anarchy of childhood and disturbs the supposedly clean boundaries between adults and children, winners and losers. And while failure certainly comes accompanied by a host of negative affects, such as disappointment, disillusionment, and despair, it also provides the opportunity to use these negative affects to poke holes in the toxic positivity of contemporary life. Both Gallagher and Roy, I would argue, do precisely this. They poke holes in the toxic positivity of contemporary life in the context of the extreme brutality of the neoliberal economies of Ireland and India. Neither Anjem nor Gio, nor indeed many minor characters like Saddam Hussein or Tylo in Ministry or Lotta in Beautiful Pictures, none of these characters conform to stereotypical notions of success. Anjem lives in a graveyard, and Leo, by the end of Gallagher's novel, is possibly facing breast cancer. Anjem has no desire to be taken seriously, even if she does enjoy some media attention in her youth, and Gio eventually gets to that point also. Neither of these protagonists can be accused of entertaining what Halberstam calls triumphalist accounts of gay, lesbian, and transgender history that necessarily reinvest in robust notions of success and succession, unquote. Quite the contrary, in fact. Instead, what is privileged in these two novels is a sense of the simultaneous difficulty and beauty of what Halberstam calls losing one's way in the territories of failure, forgetfulness, stupidity, and negation. These characters wander, improvise, fall short, and move in circles. This means, of course, that the novels themselves also tend to wander, improvise, fall short, and move in circles. They are imperfect, as the reviews I quoted before all gleefully pointed out, but this is the point. This deliberate imperfection is underscored by having a character in each novel who is an architect. Gio's father, David, and Tylo's lover, Musa Yewi. Gio's father is involved in the notorious central bank building fiasco, and Musa is a fighter for Kashmiri separatism. In both cases, the choice of profession is symbolic. While Musa is fighting for the construction of a fairer Kashmir region, putting down the foundations for a better future, Gio's father, from a very working class background, is overlooked for promotion and indeed scapegoated when the central bank project ends up in a high-profile court case, all of which reveals the rotten foundations of Irish society, a very far cry from the ideals held up by Connolly and Pearse and other protagonists involved in the 1916 Easter Rising. These flailing foundations are reflected formally in the unwieldy nature of the novels, where characters, space-times, and diegetic strands all collide constantly. Both novels, however, offer a reconfiguration of the nuclear family. In Beautiful Pictures, this is more negative. Lottie is sexually abused by the captain, her mother's partner, and her twin brother Andreas blows himself up as an anti-capitalist statement while she unwittingly films him. Her brief relationship with Owen, the left-wing nationalist, ends when he tells her he loves her, and of the twins born from that affair, only one survives. But the Wunderkammer turns out to be full of objects and explanations which are destined to show, following on generations, how the constantly shifting, rupturing, and realigning of borders and ideologies provide context for Lotta's final action. All nuclear families are dysfunctional in this novel, but Gio and Mar temporarily embody the possibilities for queer family reconfigurations. In Ministry, Anjem falls in love with an abandoned baby girl at the observatory in Delhi, and when the baby disappears, tracks her to the home of Tylo, who has taken her, and named her Miss Jibin II in memory of Musa's daughter, who was killed by the Indian army. Anjem convinces Tylo to move in with her at the graveyard, which she does, and a form of communal parenting emerges. This, in fact, was already the case earlier in the novel when Anjem adopted a young girl, Zainab, who was living in the Quaqba. One day, a letter from the biological mother of the baby arrives at the graveyard, in which she explains that her daughter was conceived from multiple rapes due to her involvement as a Maoist guerrilla fighting on behalf of the Adivasi people against the nation state and its destructive economic and environmental policies. The mother is dead by the time the letter reaches the graveyard, but Anjem and the others, humorously and ironically referred to as, I quote, the graveyard Politburo, unquote, are able to bestow the baby's original name, Udaya, on her, while keeping her new name also. Knowing this story makes all the graveyard inhabitants, I quote, close ranks around the baby like a formation of trees or adult elephants, an impenetrable fortress in which she, unlike her biological mother, would grow up protected and loved, unquote. So from failure, destruction, and violence emerges a new collective, gender fluid, communal, and decidedly queer family configuration. So to conclude then, are these two novels decolonial, queer, terrorist border fictions sketching out contours of what we might call a border poetics? If, following Nail, we see borders as constantly shifting and as regimes of social circulation, kenopolitics, then we can, I think, see these novels as providing an aesthetic which corresponds to this, as the novels themselves are full of temporal and spatial slippage, even between those who are dead and those who are alive, and they're constantly doubling back on themselves. Terrorism looms large in both novels, whether by individuals or the state, and suggests that territorial border disputes, usurpations, and violence have long been the most devastating aspects of our increasingly globalized world. Queer subjects in this context have the power to disrupt hegemonic ways of being by investing marginal spaces and refusing or failing to conform. But most of all, these novels are, I posit, decolonial in their content and aesthetics. Thematically, they contest the neoliberal narrative which is presented as modernity and progress, especially in post-colonial states like Ireland and India, and they reveal to what extent this agenda is contingent upon exploitation, expropriation, and elimination. Formally, these novels disrupt. Gone, I think, are the days of writing back. Ireland and India write back to themselves in these texts, and a very ugly mirror image is held up for scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for that wonderful lecture. Especially, you were quite rightly said at the beginning that not many of us are well acquainted with the modern Irish literature, especially post-colonial literature. So you have opened not just a window, but a big door for us. You know, it already gives us ideas to start reading up Irish literature now. Our Irish literature knowledge is fixed with Madame Gregory and the old Irish Revolution that we all did in our, school and then post-school classes in English. Now, as you can see from the chat box, that there have been a lot of questions generated from your paper. I will first ask to unmute somebody you know very well, our very dear Claire. She's there and she wants to ask you a question. Claire, would you please unmute and open your video so that we can see you and you can ask Fiona directly?
Hello, I'm not sure. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here across time zones. It's quite unreal to me. I'm sorry, I cannot open my video because I'm using not the device I'll be using tomorrow. But can you hear my voice?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Good.
Yeah.
This was just a very general question I wanted to ask you, Fiona. Thanking you for this wonderful talk, understanding that when one engages into comparisons, it's always such, I admire people who can do that because they can cross borders, as Bill was saying earlier on, and these are powerful acts of the imagination. So thank you for what you did. And my question also had to do with borders, but borders of a generic genre. I was wondering if there are political aspects in Roy's novel that require fiction or the form of the novel for their expression, because she's written so many essays and political pamphlets, and she's been very outspoken in recent years. She's only written 2 novels. So what could she do in a novel that she couldn't do in one of her many moments of outspokenness in the media or even in books or essays? Thank you.
Thanks, Claire, for that question. That's it's a hard question to answer because in many ways I think the novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, is like a fictional companion piece to a lot of her political work, her non-fictional work. But I think perhaps one possible response might be, and it resonates a little bit with something that Bill mentioned too, about the possibilities of fiction for presenting things differently. There's nothing utopian at all about the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, but I think that there are I think that for example, the kind of longish quotation that I read there about the way in which violence crept into the Kashmiri region, and it's presented in a very gothic, almost almost surreal kind of form, is a flight of fancy, certainly, like a use of the imagination and a different way of presenting something that might speak to people differently than a political tract. Mm-hmm. And I also think that her nonfiction targets certain, or is read by, let's say, certain people, and fiction maybe a slightly wider spread, mm-hmm. And is also a way of making political statements. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, Claire, but.
No, thank you. I mean, it's just that it is a difference that I'm curious about.
Yeah.
And, it is so remarkable that even the most articulate political activists, and Okri is also another example, people who can sort of wield together art and politics with some topics or on some issues, have to resort to what fiction only can do, yeah. and express. And I'm curious about those vectors that in fiction make it possible to, as you said, reach out, touch people in a way that is so unique. And so and it is also our job, of course, to try and understand how this works. That's a very person.
I think too, sorry, just as I'm listening to you, it's become clear to me what I think I mean. This is personal, this is how I respond to fiction, but probably it's the same for all of us. I suppose the difference is that when you are interested and invested in a character in a novel, mm-hmm. Our emotional roller coaster is vaster, let's say, than when we read a political text. And I'm thinking also of Amitav Ghosh, mm-hmm. who, I was kind of worried after I read The Great Derangement, thinking, right, that's it, he's never going to write fiction again, because he basically says that, fiction isn't up to the task. And then he published Gun Island, and again, we see that need where it's the storytelling, in fact, and the investment in character that perhaps is what gives fiction it's not the upper hand, but makes it kind of necessary, at least as one possibility.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how. Yeah, okay, we'll have this conversation later. Thank you so much. It's just the screen. The screen gives you the impression that there's just the 2 of you, but there are 110 people listening in. So let's hear your students.
Okay.
Shabani, thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire, for asking me a lovely question. And so the session has warmed up. I will now invite Shobhik Datta, who is faculty of our English department, TDP College, to conduct the question answer session. As you can see, there are a lot of questions in the chat box. Over to Shobhik. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So good afternoon to everybody. I have a question from Mr. Boyjanto Mukherjee, and he asks the question, that if Arundhati Roy's and Gallagher's representation of border politics and crisis is harrowing, then why are they both criticized instead of being lauded, for their brave and experimental approach? Means what if they're ruffling the feathers of the governments, if they're ruffling the feathers of the authorities, why are they not being lauded by the people? Instead, they're being criticized often.
Yes,
It's a
thank
question
you.
from Mr. Bojanto Mukherjee.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's a really important one because, as you say, predictably enough, authorities and nationalities, don't look kindly on these kinds of representations if they even deign to think that fiction, in fact, has any importance whatsoever. But what's even more interesting is that the literary establishment has been, much more in the case of Arundhati Roy. Mia Gallagher doesn't have anywhere near the notoriety of Roy, and so it's a different scenario. But to think back to, for example, Aileen Battersby, the reviewer in the Irish Times, who basically criticised Roy for being not Rushdie-like enough. I mean, it's unreal that this kind of disqualification can occur. So when Rushdie does something political, it's fine. But when Roy does it, it's not. And I do think that there's this one of the things that I'm kind of battling with in my own kind of personal research at the moment is to move away from judgment values on how good or bad literature is. Because I think that who are we to say really what's good and bad? Because each of us subjectively has a response to various texts. So I think rather than focus on, I think that this means that we have to apply a very canonical, almost grid-like, evaluative way of looking at literature. So rather than looking at that, I'm interested in sidelining the question of whether it's good or bad literature. And some of the critics, I think, tended to sideline Roy by saying this book isn't as good as it should be. I want to put that question aside and say it doesn't matter. You might think it's bad, I might think it's good. That's not the question. The question is, what aesthetic tools does Roy use to convey a political statement? That's all I'm interested in. And I think that critics who are very fast to criticize books, for novels in particular, for being too political, I think they're in their ivory tower. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it's a good question.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. I'll move on to the next question then. It's from Ujjaini Sinha Roy, and she asks that the nature of Ireland and Kashmir can be considered quite similar, well, except for the sea. Does nature play a part in these struggles for sovereignty?
Thank you for that question. That's also very interesting. I mean, obviously, there are, I think, a lot of parallels to be made in terms of the fallout of partition in both Ireland and India, Pakistan, let's say, and there's been quite a lot of work done on that. What is interesting, I think, is that the north of Ireland and Kashmir are still kind of contested territories, and I think that obviously it's much more complex in Kashmir. Partly because it's landlocked in a way that Ireland isn't. As you were saying, the sea is the difference, and the situation is less complex in Ireland because we have there is a kind of geological entity which is the island, right, and then Britain across the way. So I think that changes the I suppose the issues at stake. The other is that population-wise, the scale is obviously tiny in Ireland in comparison to the Kashmiri conflict. Although I suppose if we look at the 30-year conflict in the north, there are similarities to be established there. So yeah, it's not something actually that I've thought enough about, and I'll have to think a little bit more about that. When you say, does nature play a part in these struggles for sovereignty? It's there, obviously, but I would say that nature, in the sense of, the geological kind of construction of Ireland as an island, renders the border question there different to the one in Kashmir.
Thank you, ma'am. I would like to request Dr. Nilanjana Chatterjee if she could ask her question directly, means by unmuting herself. Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shobit. Thank you, Fiona, ma'am. It was wonderful. And in fact, this is not a sort of question, but an observation. And this is an observation which actually a thought-provoking talk has made me to, ponder upon. I think, about the 5th August 2019, the Black Day in India, when the government of India actually limited the autonomy of Kashmir by imposing Article 370. And I would just like to share my anxiety with you. Within this context, Arundhati Roy has sufficiently problematized the concept of azadi. Because when the Kashmiris in the street of Kashmir call for azadi, it is completely different from the way I call for azadi in West Bengal. So I just thought of sharing this anxiety with you. This is how we are going. We are experiencing azadi in India, a completely two different perspective of azadi, and we are helplessly suffering. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for that. I think that's a really, really important point, and I think the whole question of independences and nationalisms that we were talking about before is so complex that I think, first of all, we have to use plural forms. I think that's one way of gesturing towards the complexity of different situations, and recognizing that people's requests or demands are context specific. And so the vocabulary that we use in one context, if we use that same vocabulary in another context, as you say, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. And so, yes, it invites us, I think, to be more reflective, perhaps, on the vocabulary that we use. And so for me, what I have, the best that I've come up with is to use plural forms to indicate that, in the case of nationalism, for example, that there's a big difference between kind of right-wing nationalist extremism in Ireland or India or wherever, and emancipatory nationalisms. So it's a really good point. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, ma'am.
Just a minute, Saurabh. Fiona, can we take 2 more questions? Do you have the time?
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, carry on, Shobik.
Okay, ma'am. So I have one more question from Boyjanto Mukherjee, and he asks that, does the graveyard symbolize an all-inclusive and a flexible society that every other society or social establishment rather strive to achieve?
Thank you for that question too. I mean, the graveyard. What's really interesting about the graveyard is that it's a rejection of all of the way of the establishment, all of the ways in which societies are constructed, and especially neoliberal societies are invited to citizens, if you like, or the populations of neoliberal societies are invited to constantly conform to consumerist imperatives, to live in a certain way, and that way might be very comfortable, but we're still kind of streamlined into that. And so the graveyard, I think, in Roy's novel definitely symbolizes an all-inclusive and a flexible society, but and that is something to strive towards, but that striving towards that means opting out. In fact, it means placing oneself on the margins of society. And so in that sense, I don't think it's possible for other societies to strive to that, because it's counterintuitive. It's a counter behavior, really. It's placing oneself on the margins. So I would say that the people can strive to, extricate themselves from the status quo, but not a society, because a society is always going to go, needs to order itself. So what's interesting for me about the graveyard is, yes, that it's all inclusive and flexible, but that it's marginal. And in fact, if it doesn't stay marginal and if it becomes mainstream, then it won't be cutting edge anymore. So it's a little bit like some of the discourses that we have around, for example, around gay pride celebrations that have become very mainstream, completely co-opted by the neoliberal agenda, and that so then you have like kind of counter gay pride manifestations going on, where there's an opting out of that. So as soon as something becomes too mainstream, it's not cutting edge anymore. So that's why the graveyard is interesting in this novel, is because it's, you know, and who wants to live in a graveyard really? Also, so you know, it's fascinating from that point of view.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that detailed answer. I'll take one more question from Rema Neelamegam. And she asks that, you know, does Roy exactly contemplate on the political aspects of the nation, or does she simply talk about the independence of women? Besides being a stern political activist and feminist, is she politically active in her novels?
Yes, she, I think, in her novels broaches all different kinds of independence. So one of them being, I mean, the Ministry of Utmost Happiness is, even the very title, the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, I think celebrates caring, ministry, you know, caring for others. And part of that involves a reflection on a national level, right, in terms of what the nation, how the nation cares or does not care for or about certain citizens of the nation. And then other parts of the novel are, and I thank you for raising the question of feminism, because there is one really strong female character in the novel, Ministry of Utmost Happiness, who also opts out, refuses to, so she's a freedom fighter, and refuses to engage with kind of, once again, neoliberal kind of consumerist aspects of feminism, places herself on the margins. So yes, I would say Roy is absolutely politically active in her novels, but I don't think that this stops the novel or novels being, you know, very interesting aesthetic objects. Also, I'm using that specifically, that term, aesthetic objects, as opposed to good novels, which I do think they are. Again, to move away from valuative judgments on the quality of literature. But so yes, she's politically active, and she's also a very accomplished novelist, I think.
Thank you, ma'am. With that, we have come to an end of our Q&A session. I'd like to hand over the virtual microphone to Dr. Sharbani Banerjee, ma'am, to continue the proceedings. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, now we can rest in peace, because we have had a fantastic session, starting with Dr. Ashcroft and now with my good friend Fiona. What a wonderful way to end today. Thank you so much for making out time. I know their semesters are going on. They are very, very busy, but they could not say no to me. That is what I carry with me. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. And I will be poking you again for some Irish literature later on, Fiona.
Absolutely no problem. It will be a pleasure to share with you on that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. With this, we conclude today's session. And all the participants here, we welcome you for tomorrow. It will start at 4:30. And tomorrow's first speaker is here with us today, Claire. I'm welcoming you in advance, and will welcome you more specially tomorrow. Thank you so much. Shorab, will you complete
Yes.
the session?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Fiona McCann and Bill Ashcroft, Professor Bill Ashcroft. And let me remind you that tomorrow the webinar is going to commence at 4:30. The portal
Yes.
will be there. It will be open from 4:25 p.m. And tomorrow we shall have two distinguished invited speakers, Claire Omovere, and another very distinguished speaker, Professor Bivas Choudhury, and both of them will speak on the post-colonialism and post-colonial theories, applications of post-colonial theories, etc. So we congratulate as well as we thank all the participants for supporting us, and we also encourage you, yes, to attend tomorrow's webinar. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
And I just have one more thing to add, that today's audience here have been a wonderful admixture of, there have been so
Yes,
many
yes,
senior university professors,
yes.
there have been many college academicians, there have been research scholars, students from Bengal, from Orissa, from the south. I want to thank each of you individually. But due to paucity of time, I am just generalizing, and I say that your presence has further enriched this program. Thank you so much. And we expect and we, cordially invite you for the other 2 days as well. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Namaskar.
Thank you all.
Bye, Fiona.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.